Hello, everyone. Just a couple of quick announcements before I introduce tonight's speaker. First of all, the speaker will respond to questions after she's finished her lecture. Feel free to submit the questions into the queue at any time by using the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your Zoom window. We also have available closed captioning. To enable the captions, click the live transcription button also at the bottom of your screen. And now, good evening and welcome to tonight's presentation at the Graduate School of Design. I'm Michael Hayes. I'm director of the Master of Design Studies program, and I'm absolutely honored to be able to introduce tonight's presentation. The MDes program defines itself as one of progressive research across the social, technological, and historical dimensions of our designed environments and objects. And our speaker tonight, Professor Anlin Cheng, visiting us from Princeton University, is at the absolute forefront of work of that kind. She's an interdisciplinary and comparative race scholar who focuses on the often uneasy intersection between politics and aesthetics, drawing from race and gender studies, architectural theory, legal studies, psychoanalysis, and media studies, and others. In particular, Professor Cheng's work has brought us robust new ways of thinking the interaction of European modernism, and especially modernism and primitivism, and how racial and sexual fetishes interact with aesthetic and technical design experiences to interrupt, contest, and overwrite each other. Now, the example that our students, at least the students in the architecture program, will know, since the reading is on the bibliography, or the book is on the bibliography of our required core readings, is Professor Cheng's book called Second Skin, which includes a stunning chapter on the house designed for Josephine Baker by Adolf Loos. This is, I think, the single best treatment of this difficult subject. Cheng's interest is not in just calling out Loos's Eurocentric sexism and racism, but nor is she interested just in finding agency and subversion in Baker's performance, though she does that too. But her real inquiry is how the object of architecture, the house, was engaged by Loos and Baker, as well as how they were engaged by the house in a kind of pas de trois of primitivist modernism. By treating each member of this trio, Loos, Baker, and house, as both subject and object, Cheng shows that alongside acts of misrecognition, cultural appropriation, and kind of exercise of duplicitous power, that the three actors clad themselves in skins not their own. And through their acts of design, this is referring to the second skin, constructed themselves anew as imagined subject in a very layered and complex erotics of identity projection. Cheng calls this method of reading that allows this much more complex description of the interactions a reading practice, I'm quoting, that is willing to follow rather than suppress the wayward life of subject and object in dynamic interface, to step outside the moral economies of the visual, the categorical, and the critical, and to be led by and attend to what the objects have to teach us. It's a fascinating way of reading that she has developed. In her latest book, which we will hear from, I hope, tonight, entitled Ornamentalism, Professor Cheng turns to a very different kind of racialized, objectified body, one that survives through the abstract and the synthetic rather than, in the case of Second Skin, more or less organic and performative. Please welcome with me Professor Anlin Cheng, delivering a lecture entitled Monsters, Cyborgs, and Vases, Apparitions of the Yellow Woman. Anne.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for that very generous introduction. And I'm delighted to be here. I also want to thank the staff at the graduate school for making my visit, virtual as it is, very welcoming, and everything is going smoothly so far. So thank you so much. I'd like to warn people, the talk is 45 minutes long. There will at least be good images to look at. So today I want to trace for you a genealogy of anthropomorphic non-persons, which is to say, a spectral history of the yellow woman. In race and feminist studies, we speak about the Black woman, the brown woman, the white woman, but rarely the yellow woman. Why not? It can't be because she is no longer racialized or gender figured. On the contrary, we find apparitions of her, the lotus blossom, the dragon lady, the geisha, the China doll, the exotic temptress, everywhere, in songs and movies, from the marketing boardroom to the bedroom, and recently, violently and tragically, in the news. So how is it that a figure so laden with racist and sexist meanings, so ubiquitously deployed to this day, and so easily recognized by almost all as a symptom, should at the same time remain such a theoretical black hole? One of the reasons why the yellow woman remains so under-theorized, as academics like to say, aside from the general malaise of indifference that surrounds the Asian American figure in mainstream American culture, has to do with the ways in which she has been associated with a particular kind of design femininity. That is, yellow womanhood instantiates a condition of denigration and violence that insistently and paradoxically speak through the language of aesthetic privilege. This is why, even as this figure is subjected to so much racist and sexist meaning, we still find people who ask, is she an injured figure at all? What makes the yellow woman the exception in the larger category of women of color is precisely the precariousness of her injury, a fact that has been taken both for granted by some and questioned by many others. I want to focus today on the idea or the concept of this aesthetic privilege of the yellow woman, its history, and its incarnations in our contemporary world. So I'm going to go past them to the present. For centuries, in European American visual and literary culture, there has been long an association, even confusion, between notions of Asiatic femininity and excessive ornamentality, a tradition that reaches back as far as Plato, who described sophistry as Oriental, through the writings of Marco Polo in the 13th century, the novels of Boris Karl Guzman and Oscar Wilde. And we see this confusion in the visual expressions of Art Nouveau, French symbolism, American Rococo, all the way up to wide-ranging iterations in the 20th and 21st centuries. Let us take a moment now to allow this vast, extensive history to sink in. I'm going to screen share. So I'm just going to run through some slides just to show you this history that I'm talking about. It is really quite remarkable how expansive and enduring this aesthetic practice is. The yellow woman can be so easily invoked through objects, scents, textures, A fan, a perfume, a kimono, the swerve of silk, the cool stillness of porcelain. She is so suffused with representation that she has become invisible, so encrusted by aesthetic expectation that she may not be present at all to generate the specter of her affect. Like the proverbial Ming vase, she is at once ethereal and base, an object of value and a hackneyed trope. What is even more remarkable is how poor our critical vocabulary is in the face of this extraordinarily extensive archive. We can decry these as examples of Orientalist commodification, fetishization, and appropriation. But labeling something a stereotype often means we end up stop seeing it. There is still so much that is uncanny, unexamined, unresolvable, not to mention still alive about this trope. What kind of a person gets created out of ornamental thingliness? How do we understand the making of a racialized gender that has been highly eroticized and yet hardly acquires a real body to make its fullest, most sensorial presence known? While critical race theory and Black feminism have done the vital work of reminding us that the Black woman has been reduced to bare flesh, those insights have not been as helpful in theorizing the figure of a racialized woman who is synthetic and assiduously assembled. This is a very different kind of racial embodiment and one that asks us to attend to it differently. This is why I have turned to what I call ornamentalism in order to address what I think of as the object condition of Asiatic femininity. The word is obviously a sort of conflation between the ornamental and the Oriental, and I use the term to describe the Western philosophical and aesthetic traditions of conflating the so-called Oriental and Oriental character with the ornamental and the feminine. But more than naming a symptom, I want the concept to highlight the dynamic processes whereby personhood gets named or conceived through synthetic ornamental gestures. These processes can be legal, material, cultural, phantasmatic. I'm interested in bringing to the foreground those eerie moments, and they happen more often and more visibly than we think, when a person or an idea of personness gets vivified through the minute, the sartorial, the decorative, the prosthetic through design. Often the alchemy of ornamentalism can be insidious and exact devastating consequences. But rather than simply decrying or denying these conditions, we need to do the harder work of examining what are the terms of a personhood that has been constructed of objectness. We have to ask the difficult question of what it means to survive as or through crushing objecthood. Ornamentalism for me is not just about having been person made into thing. It is, which is very, oftentimes something we always think of around the history of race, but it is also about the condition of life and possible animacy within objectness. It is about how personhood might be indebted to object. In other words, not just how persons get turned into things, but how things get turned into persons. And to focus on the making of a highly artificial, ornamented, and synthetic personhood is to rethink some of our most basic assumptions about freedom and agency, about what constitutes a person, and what kind of a life can count. If Edward Said's concept of Orientalism offered us a powerful critique, I like to think of ornamentalism as offering us a theory of being. To offer some examples of what ornamentalism can teach us that Orientalism alone cannot, I want to start by returning to our 21st century geisha, which the image that you see here. And we might ask, what is it about the yellow woman that allows her to be, at least in the Western racial imaginary, at once the symbol of regressive atavism and the symbol of technological futurity, both the slave girl and the cyborg? Many of you will recognize these images from Rupert Sanders' recent live-action remake of the Japanese anime Ghost in the Shell. Set in Japan in the year 2029, Ghost in the Shell tells the story of a cyborg policewoman named Motoko Kusanagi, and her partner who hunt a mysterious and powerful hacker of human minds called the Puppet Master. In Sanders' reimagining, Major Kusanagi is played by Scarlett Johansson, a casting that had many criticized Sander for Orientalist appropriation and for whitewashing, and indeed yellowface. And indeed, Orientalist appropriation is very often part and parcel of the sci-fi rhetoric and style, what many have come to call techno-Orientalism. And we can see this techno-Orientalism in films all through the 20th century, from Blade Runner to Big Hero 6, to Ghost in the Shell here, to Ex Machina. I can go on there. I'm sure you can also think of 1,000 examples. But I find the critical use of the term techno-Orientalism to have been a little disappointing in that it really simply rehearses a Saidian critique, except just in the realm of technology. There is, however, a much more, I think, entangled and deeper relationship between technology and the so-called Oriental, something that I hope ornamentalism can help us see. The history and alchemy of ornamentalism is fundamentally a conflation between persons and beings, as I've just said, a conflation that anticipates the crisis of the human that we are now seeing in science fiction and in cyborg fiction. The presence of the Asiatic, especially the Asiatic woman, in science fiction today often signals something much more than just a mere backdrop or decoration or exotic effect. This figure, I would argue, is in fact crucial to Western meditations on notions of futurity and the roles of persons and non-persons in our future. To spell it out, the preoccupation with animation of the inanimate isn't just the result of 20th century technological advancement. It is a fantasy and an anxiety that reaches as far back as the long 18th century and the age of exploration, when the West first came into contact with racial others in the very real reality of person being made into things, then even as things were being taken for persons. That is to say, the longue durée of ornamentalist transformation. What fascinates me are the ways in which the Asiatic, and in particular, Asiatic femininity, operates in these fantasies as the very engine, the very body for science fiction's most profound meditation between what constitutes the human versus the inhuman. After all, the very plot and the central philosophic obsession of a film like Ghost in the Shell is precisely this anxiety about the uneasy affinity between the human and the inhuman. Much of the film is about whether we, or Kusanagi herself, consider Kusanagi to be deserving of human consideration when she is, quote, but a machine, end quote. And the only and more persuasive thing that lends the human element and hence pathos to this impervious killing machine is the minute trace we find out of a human consciousness believed to be still residing inside of her, which, by the way, was sort of a human remnant around which the AI has been built. This remnant, by the way, and most crucially, turns out to be the cranial residue of a young Japanese girl, an anti-cyborg tech activist whose body was destroyed and then hijacked for this experiment. Now, as I just mentioned, critics have pointed out that Sender is whitewashing the Japanese anime by casting Scarlett Johansson to be the major. But to see the Japanese girl origin of Major Kusanagi as merely an Oriental detail in the story is to neglect the ornamentalist magic that provides the foundation for the film's meditation on what constitutes human and how that humanness slips rather than actually distinguishes between the organic and the inorganic. That is to say, the revelation of the, quote, real Asian woman inside the synthetic white machine actually dramatizes the racial logic that has been enabled by ornamentalism. And let me explain what I mean by that. Since the dream of the yellow woman has always assumed a dream about the inorganic, we can safely say that Asiatic femininity has always been seen as somewhat prosthetic. The yellow woman is an, if not the original cyborg in this sense. She reminds us that the human has always been embroiled with the inhuman well before the threat of the modern machine. Given this, we don't need the 21st century cyborg for us to confront the discomfort of an undeniable human alterity. That has been a crisis provoked by the racial other, and more specifically, a racial otherness that is implicated with the mechanical and the artisanal, the way that I think Asiatic femininity has been. Asiatic femininity as a strange embodiment that is also not enfleshment, haunts ghosts in the shell, playing itself out in various ways, including, I think, most compulsively on the surfaces of the film, in the flickering holograms of the mise-en-scène, the hygienic surfaces of the Frankensteinian lab in which Kusanagi was made, and on the skin of our heroine herself. It is not a coincidence that the most visually arresting and most philosophically suggestive element in the film, I think, is her skin, her epidermis, right? An arresting combination of resilient matter and willful transparency, seamed yet seamless, a collation of fragmented and variegated nudes, a bareness that is also an armor. The major suprahuman and sartorial skin exemplifies pure impenetrable technology, but it also carries quite visually the supposedly unseen, porous, and fractured history of human labor, by which I don't mean the delicate hands of her scientific surgeon creator, but the laboring race body underneath the slave logic of the cyborg. The very surface of Johansson's or Major's white, inorganic, implacable, and impeccable skin, precisely as a kind of cladding, and acts counterintuitively a deep dive into Asiatic femininity. She is a 21st century technological shell encasing the traumatic kernel of Europe-American imperialism and racial history. Let us not forget that the Major is a product and a daughter of an American industrial giant heralding high-tech progress in a corporate conglomerate state called Japan. This is from the movie. So if one of the global inhuman humans that emerged out of Western imperial history was the slave, and as well as the Asiatic version of the slave, that is to say the Chinese coolie, a male laboring body mythologized as infinitely capable of enduring pain, a mechanical ideal laborer. And if one of the other inhuman figures emerging out of the 19th century was the Oriental woman, a female decorative disposable toy for leisure, then we might think of the Major here as a merging of both, a body of labor and numb endurance, but also a smooth body of beauty that bears the lines of his own wreckage, a delicacy that is also impermeable and insensate. She is both toy and soldier. Throughout most of the film, the protagonist, played by Johansson, is simply named the Major. Sanders suppresses for most of the film the original anime character's full and obviously explicitly Japanese name. This may abet the whitewashing, but it also has the opposite effect of punching up the big reveal at the end, the disclosure that the Major's white body has been playing host to a Japanese brain. It punched out this reveal by fulfilling a racial logic that has been implicit all along. In the original anime series, the most chilling philosophic proposition is not that machines and cyborgs can be hijacked, but that human consciousness can be hijacked. In Sanders' film version, the pathos of the human as vulnerable yet mechanical is augmented by precisely the spectral evocation of Asiatic femininity, an imaginary engine that switches between the thingness of persons and the persons of things. The film may tell us a cautionary tale about how people have been turned into things. Consider this memorable line spoken to our heroine in the movie when her friend said to her in a sort of a consolation, quote, "They did not save your life, they stole it," end quote. But the history of Orientalism in the West is not just a history of objectification, but also a history of personification, the making of persons out of things. This non-person, normally seen as outside of modernity and opposed to organic human individualism, actually embodies a forgotten genealogy about the coming together of life and non-life, labor and style that conditions the modern conceit of humanness. When the major looked into the face of the geisha robot earlier, in a barely disguised mirror scene, her comrade is quick to assure her of their distinction. He says to her, "Don't worry, you're not like that." But we suspect that what is being disavowed here is precisely the complex and messy interpenetration of race, gender, and machine. Being a cyborg and a hybrid human being, a hybrid being, the major is exactly, in fact, like the robot, Asian, other, alien. And this condition of otherness is paradoxically the very alibi used to sort of prove, right, her humanity. So race and femininity become supplements that enable this film's desire to toggle between the human and the inhuman. And so now we have arrived at sort of a double-edged sword. Racial and gender differences entail a history of profound dehumanization, but they have also provided the most powerful and affective agents for humanizing the dreams of synthetic inventions. What is inside the machine? The yellow woman, the ghost within the ghost. The biological revelation at the end of Ghost in the Shell is thus but a literalization of this insight. And this is also why the Asiatic woman can play double roles, simultaneously atavistic, the geisha, the slave girl, and futuristic, the automaton, the cyborg. The artificiality of Asiatic femininity is the ancient dream that feeds the machine in the heart of modernity. Recently, in 2015, I encountered another figure in this genealogy of cyborgian yellow woman. This time, she's made of ceramic. Here, aesthetic congealment has grown into full body edifice. The to-be-used Chinese female body seems to have petrified into domestic and collectible things, pieces of teapots, cups, plates, whose value now resides in their aggressive uselessness. At the same time, this congealed and fractured domesticity, offering purposelessness, transcends its own quotidianness to lay claim to art. Made by contemporary artist Li Xiaofan, this piece is clearly not human, but nor is it entirely a thing. The weight of material, of history, of domesticity, of femininity here implies petrification, but the form also suggests light. Is this dress or armor? Is it winged victory or the mad woman in the attic? A tribute to monumentality or a concession to the mundane? What has died here, the human or the ornament? And finally, has the human outmoded itself or has the object outrun the human demand? Entitled Beijing Memory No. 5, Li's 2009 sculpture was part of a series known for using ceramics excavated from archaeological sites throughout China. The museum catalog attributes the ceramic fragments. By the way, this is from exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum called China Through the Looking Glass, which some of you probably are familiar with. So the museum catalog attributes the ceramic fragments to the Qing dynasty, which is 1644 to 1912, commonly known as the last great Chinese dynastic empire, suggesting that the memory being recomposed here may be the memory of a lost imperial China. Yet Beijing Memory No. 5 exercises a particularly intricate articulation of Chinese datedness by insisting on a historicity that upon closer examination has been subjected to much manipulation. Let me explain what I mean by that. In the constructed rubble that is the body of this ceramic woman, we discern a scattering of some still intact Chinese ideograms. Many are out of context and several are positioned upside down, which, an ironic jab at value, an old joke about Chinese illegibility for Western viewers. There's various ways to sort of read about that. But what I do want to point out for now is that These words that you could discern are words like precious, tea, superior. Others seem to offer very sort of precise self-authentication with stamped reign dates, such as you could see one of the on the left, it says Wang reign of the Great Ming Dynasty, which is 1426 to 1435. And so the signature purport to indicate a royal workshop. That's actually much older than what the museum catalog says. And part of the reason why that discrepancy happened is because the dates, the shards date themselves even further back in time than what the catalog indicate. But we cannot remain complacent within these fragments promise of a more antique, more precious commodified pastness, because those certifications of provenance, both inside and outside of the artwork, only serve to underscore in many ways the homelessness of these remnants. Because given that the practice of inscribing dates onto objects degraded fairly early on into acts of affectation and even forgery, this kind of designation is likely to be more misleading than not. And since an earlier date would signal a grander pretentiousness and a greater value, and since the Zhuang era was exactly when such inscription and forgery first become common, these fragments are probably anything but Zhuang dynasty, right? Decorative ornament and utilitarian domesticity merge in this piece. Reassembled, but also stranded, an object dart, and a collection of disposable things, this collection of broken disposable things, a thing of memory and troubled origin, an object in transit between the junkyard, the workshop, the commercial gallery, and the museum. Li Ceramic Woman underscores the unstable difference between curio and treasure, between both mediated precisely through notions of Chineseness. This uneasy fluctuation between value and waste always haunts the curio anyway, which is to say, it haunts the so-called Oriental thing. The Oriental curio, then, is the material sediment of the crisis of aura. We could think of it that way, right? That is, if the decay of aura has been attributed to technological advancement by, as per Benjamin, then we must remind ourselves that the ceramic woman too is a kind of technology, a mechanical assemblage forged out of abandoned, once auric residue. This is flesh congealed into porcelain, as well as porcelain invoking the possibility of flesh, that is to say, the female presence that is suggested by the dress, but also that might be using the teapots and et cetera, right? So Beijing memory number 5 Beijing memory number 5's meditation on formal assemblage and stifling mass push us to confront the simultaneity of a process of dematerialization and materialization through which raised female bodies come to be invoked. It instantiates the salvage, the reassemblage, and the subjunctiveness behind Asiatic female corporeality, making her something of a teleological sister to Major Kusanagi and other recent Asian cyborgs. If the yellow woman has always been simultaneously embodied and erased through ornamental objectness, then both the new and old materiality of the cyborg and the ceramic woman, both conceits for human ornament, compel us to ask what is or could be life after such devastation. As if in answer to these questions, these images have recently arisen to haunt me. This is an installation view of South Korean artist Lee Bu's Cyborg and Monster series at the Arsonge Center in Seoul in 1998. Crafted from materials including metal, silicone, resin, chain, crystal beads, and organic matter, Lee Bu's twin series, Cyborgs and Monsters, shown here together, dramatizes the complicity between the organic and the inorganic, between art and waste. We might think of these works as meditations on the apparitions of the yellow woman, for they represent the two teleological endpoints of Asiatic femininity in a world of ornamentalist logic, the monster or the cyborg. The monster being the perversion of organic excess, while the cyborg being the distillation of synthetic beauty and functionality. And although at first glance, the cyborg's minimalist, clean white lines would seem to contrast against the extruding colors and vibrant inks of the amorphous monsters in the same show, on closer look, they actually share more than one might initially think. The pristine cyborgs are nonetheless, if you notice, all headless and otherwise fragmented, missing an arm or a leg, a perfect and imperfect human conceit. The monsters, on the other hand, are congealed, yet suggestive of growth, fullness, and animacy, a bursting out of life, a fermentation that is also nonetheless equally arrested. In short, we might think of the cyborg and the monsters as sisters. And let me end our genealogy today with this. This piece is by South Korean artist Yoo Sung-kyung, entitled Translated Vase, made in 2015. The sculpture clearly mimes a human female figure. The legs and the head, you can sort of see head and legs and arms, right? It's suggestive of a humanoid figure, even as the material and the title insist that it is a thing, a translated vase. In the artist's own words, she writes, this is from an interview that the artist did, quote, "The translated vase series consists of sculptures reconstructed from discarded ceramic fragments. Skillful ceramic masters reproduce traditional Korean ceramics, and the vases with minor defects are destroyed to keep the rarity and value of the surviving masterpieces. I pieced together these destroyed pots back together in the manner of three-dimensional jigsaw puzzles, covering the cracks in gold. From the moment of destruction, I obtained a chance to intervene and fabricate new narratives with my own translation," end quote. With translated vase or vase, each broken piece operates as a self-forming agent that appears to be generating an infinite proliferation toward an unexpected fabrication, an assemblage of fictitiously loquacious and stuttering discards, suggesting not only that art and waste, the human and the inhuman can coexist, but also that they may be profoundly, materially, and imaginatively indebted to one another. This piece reminds me of a Mandarin phrase in Chinese, pinghua, that is usually used to describe women. Pinghua literally means vase, but is used pejoratively to refer to women who serve as decorative backgrounds, like, say, a trophy wife. Here, the pinghua, the decorative vase, has become a once more artful and more resistant, more broken and more reassembled. If Beijing Memory Number 5 was all about the crisis of history, memory, femininity, and things as person, and if Li Bu cyborgs and monsters extend that meditation to their most monstrous and technological ends, then we might think about Yi Soo-kyung's deliberately anthropomorphic non-person here as an instantiation of that convergence. It is as if Li's ceramic woman has suffered an internal explosion, becoming at once more voluptuous and more thing-like, somehow simultaneously more woman and more thing. The artist here invokes the history of ceramic as well as invention and as global commodity in the 19th century. She also references what I have been calling the history of ornamentalism, underscoring Asiatic femininity's paradoxical, often attributed excess of organicity and inorganicity, tracking the afterlife and perhaps the weird beauty of survival of Asiatic femininity as ornament. The feminist theorist Donna Haraway famously asserted that she would rather be a cyborg than a goddess. by which she meant that she preferred the option of being a postmodern technologized figure of techno-human hybridity over the reclamation of some naturalized, matrilinear, and idealized notion of femininity. But the genealogy of monsters, cyborgs, and vases that we have been following tonight suggests that, to say the least, we need something beyond the dyad of cyborg versus goddess. If the Asian woman in the Western cultural imagination is the cyborg par excellence, that always curious assemblage of fleshly fantasies and projected inanimate objectness, and if the cyborg is always already a monster at heart, and if monstrosity offered the very possibility of life and art, then we must radically reconsider what is beauty in a broken world, as well as what is human. What are the conditions of being human? Thank you. Let me stop sharing.
And thank you so very, very much, Anne. It was really wonderful. Our audience, I think, are gathering their wits and we'll submit some questions soon. I have just a couple of things I'd like to pursue a little bit. And it was coming quickly, and I was trying to recall again the second skin by way of a kind of comparative theory of not only Black woman, but it seems that for me that second skin was not just Josephine's skin, but it was all it was the idea, and you brought it up again today, of skin and cladding, and you again use both terms today. And for architects, of course, this is a very vivid pair of words because of Zimper and Lohse and others and their use of cladding. But cladding seems something, and you seem to use it true to this, that does have agency, that is designed, that is intentional, and to some extent controllable by the subject, or it's an operation on the object that's controlled by the subject. Whereas skin we think of as something biological, given, of course you deconstruct that it's not controllable. Of course it's controllable, and of course it's construction, but somehow cladding seems even more constructed. And what I'm trying to get at is that in your theory of the yellow woman, of ornamentalism, is agency gone altogether? Because it wasn't in the theory of the Black woman, and it had to do with the double nature of skin, cladding and skin. It had to do with that double nature, and that Josephine Baker could wear a banana dress, could clad herself in a banana dress, and in a way deconstruct the audience's racism by her cladding. But I didn't get that possibility in the theory of ornamentalism.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Thank you for that. It's always a complicated thing. So I think there is. Let me put this. I still think there is agency, but not human agency as we are normally think of it. I think that what I resist is the idea of the sartorial or cladding as a form of performance, right? Kind of like I decide to I'm going to put on whatever, femininity, or I'm going to put on, yellowness or whatever. And that's certainly is, Judith Butler has long pointed out that, culture performs you more than you think you're performing culture at a given moment. But I do think what's interesting about ornamentalism is that it allows us to see unexpected forms of agency that may not be intentional. It may not be human as we normally, like human in the sense of like a willful act, right? And so And so, for example, in thinking about the ceramic dress, it is on the one hand, we could see it as, the reification of broken, fragmented Asiatic femininity. You pretty much can't get more literal than that, right? That dress actually like stands, it's not just a dress, it's actually a body, right? But at the same time, when we look at it closely, what I was trying to suggest is that the ways in which it's assembled, its fragmentation, its very brokenness, evinces a certain kind of resistance, a certain kind of monumentality in spite of its brokenness. And so I do think there's agency there, but I can't attribute that agency to a person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's very clear. That's very helpful. We do have one question from the audience. It's from Isabel Liao. She is bringing up the very difficult to think about for me issue of how ornamentalism and your construction and your theorization of ornamentalism somehow relates to violence against Asian women, how the status of ornamentalism and also especially in its relation to sexualization, though it is more than that too, she acknowledges how that relates to the issue of violence.
It's a great question. I actually wrote, so after the incident I was thinking about, when I said it about in the news, I was thinking about a recent incident, the shooting in Atlanta, where 8 people were killed, 6 of whom were Asian American women. And the shooter basically said, that he had a thing for Asian women and he had to put an end to this temptation. And so he went out and killed people. And I actually wrote a piece about that for the Atlantic Monthly, the Atlantic, because I was so struck by how, his, and then the police, I don't know if people remember this, but then the police, the head of the police in Atlanta got on, some interview and said, well, the guy was just having a bad day, and it really got me thinking about how, this history. So that, as I said, there's 2 parts of ornamentalism. There's a very negative part, and then there's, I hope, a part that allows us to see, alternative forms of survival. But for me, the negative part is this long history of the women who were killed many of them were, almost all of them were mothers, some were middle-aged. These are people who are working and have families, and yet to be reduced to a sex temptation, by one person. And I, on the one hand, we think, oh, that's just, one crazy person. But actually, what that articulates is a really long history of this objectification of, and sexualization of Asian and Asian American women, right? This is a really long history. And what happened in Atlanta seemed to me is a very violent expression of something that happens all the time, much milder. I almost, every Asian American woman I know have had some experience of, being approached by a white man that's, who says, oh, I just love Asian women. And when those things happen, it's disconcerting, you step back and but what I want to point out is actually that mile, and you don't even tell people about it because it seems too small to complain. You don't, you're not going to call the police, but you don't even want to tell other people about it. But what I want to point out is that there is actually, the history that I'm talking about, the history substanding ornamentalism is this history, right? And there's a huge spectrum from the very mild, mildly offensive to this expression of tremendous violence, and they share the same logic. And that's what's really, I think, sobering, right? So that's the connection I wanted to make.
Yeah, very good. Blythe Hunter has a question. It's a layered question, and I'll try to pull out both layers. And first of all, she thanks you, as we all do, for your amazing work on this subject. She points out that on the one hand, you use the attributes of abstract and synthetic when talking about, let's say, she calls it yellow femininity. But that the examples then of ornamentalism, especially these ceramics, are so intensely material and patinaed and complicated with age and cracks and putting back together. And then on the other side, a different kind of materiality, which is the synthetic. So you have the Kevlar skin. So you have the abstract versus she's layering it up, the abstract versus the material, and the synthetic and the material. And and then the other layer is that digital materiality seems to be yet different from object materiality or whatever. So what she's querying is how this all gets imbricated.
Yeah, I think there's so much those are all, there's so much to be teased out. So I'm just going to do a little my quick thoughts about it, which is that I think what interests me about ornamentalism is precisely how the material and the abstract are mutually imbricated, right? That is to say, I am really interested in objectness, right? Materiality, ceramics, tea, wood. The history of these objects of commodity, these commodities that are themselves abstracted materials and value, right, from the colonies for the metropoles. So I think that there's a way in which the material is being used constantly as material, right, because it's utilitarian, etc. But there's a kind of abstract value that has been attributed to them. And for me, not just abstract value in the sense of economic, not just like a Marxian sense, right, of value, but the value of human characteristics, right? The ways in which ceramic gets confused for Asiatic femininity, so that in the 19th century, when Chinese porcelain was a very coveted commodity before Europeans could reproduce the same kind of ceramic, there were all these descriptions about ceramic that sounds like it's describing people, that it's of a particularly durable substance. It can withstand tremendous heat. It can bear the color easily, and so therefore useful but also artistic. And there's actually there are also there's actually these weird crossovers in the way people talk about coolie labor and ceramic, kind of the same way, that they can endure tremendous heat, that they're sort of insensate. They're sort of ideal laborers. You could leave in the sun for a year and nothing will happen to them, or they won't feel as much as a normal person would. So they're subhuman. So I think there's oftentimes a messy interpenetration between the material, the very material, and abstract notions, right? And so I think abstraction itself has two meanings, both abstract as in, design, but also abstraction as a kind of labor and value formation. So now the digital is also a really interesting question. I don't know if I can give a really thoughtful answer about that right now. I have to think about it. But I think one of the reasons why I've been looking at a lot of films, for example, aside from the fact that I'm interested in visual culture, is this question of, what I think is really interesting about Ghost in the Shell is precisely kind of, it's a film about screens and projections, right? It's a film about, and so is Blade Runner, in fact. It's a projection that's about projection itself, which I think lends itself to us thinking harder about, race as a form of projection, right? And image making. And I also think it'd be interesting to think, I don't know the answer to this, but you'd be just now, because such a provocative question, I would love to sit down and think about how pixelation in digital format or platform may or may not connect to what I'm thinking of as these sort of images of fragmented um, the art pieces I'm interested in that are all about breaking things apart and putting it back together. So I think there's something interesting about pixelation that I would need to do more thinking around. But thank you for the really great question.
Really good question.
I'll feature with you.
Yeah. So we're not gonna. Whoops, sorry. I thought I had all that turned off. I will confess that I know that's my father because my father's ringtone is a Johnny Cash song. So, sorry, sorry, I thought I had it turned off. I want to ask what maybe the last question, and maybe I'm going to regret broaching it. But you did say you do. First of all, you do use psychoanalytic theory a lot in your work, and you did say at some point. I think it was when you were just introducing the monster and cyborg dialectic that you were dealing with something that was not human, not quite human, and yet not entirely thing. And it divided between the monster, which was this kind of congealed but fleshy condition, and the cyborg, which is more mechanical, more, I don't know, even maybe even digitized in a certain way. And I couldn't help thinking that when Lacan talks about the thing in Freud's version, in Freud it was the Nebenmensch, it was the proximate the proximate being that is yet that we're not even sure if it's human. Is it another child? It's probably not the parents. But it's something else that the child first recognizes as being both something extremely desirable and familiar. And it says that it's familiar because of this fleshy connection, but also because it can remember certain gestures. The child is familiar with certain mechanical gestures. So, but that in the end, it also turns horrifying because the thing doesn't fit. The Lacanian reading of this is that the thing doesn't fit into any existing symbolic system. And to that extent, it's horrifying. And I'm just wondering if the idea of the thing, which later he also talks about in very architectural terms, that the vocation of architecture is to enclose a void, which is the place of the thing, the domain of the thing. That architecture is nothing other than a veil. And I'm also thinking of cladding once again. And I'm thinking of, again, those ceramic cladded, which is doing nothing but cladding a void, right? Cladding the domain of the thing. And if somehow I guess I'm finding that the ornamentalist theory compared to the second skin theory and the idea in second skin of a kind of susceptibility, it almost in ornamentalism goes to almost it comes very close that the yellow woman is withdrawn from dominant domains of signification altogether, or I should say it doesn't involve oppression, it seems, so much as the black woman, but it involves systems that refuse to give her significant place, something like that. Like the thing doesn't have a place. The yellow woman is without a domain of signification in some way, right? Either hollowed out, synthetic, ceramic somehow. I'm not quite sure.
No, I agree. I mean, I think there's so much what you just said that's so rich. So I guess one argument I want to sort of insist upon is that too is a form of oppression, right? That evacuation is also a form of oppression. And part of the problem I think, in sort of a mainstream cultural discourse, race discourse, is often that it's that terrible. Actually, no, I never liked the term a comparative race scholar, because I think comparison is really not what we really want to be doing. But I do think that the part of the problem is that the discourse is usually like, we could see the material ways in which Black women have been oppressed, but Asian women, yellow women, she just been ignored. And so I wanted to first point out that there are various forms of oppression, right? But also, I think it's not quite true that the Asian woman is being ignored, right? She's actually extremely present, in all kinds of cultural, practices. But a presence as evacuated. So yeah, I do think I have to say that when I was first working on this project, so what happened, actually the ornamentalism came out of the second scene, because as I was working on Second Skin, I realized two things. One, that what's at stake here is actually a history about the ornament. And two, the history of the ornament actually involved Asiatic femininity more than Black femininity in some ways. And thirdly, I want to make the claim that actually, I think like my reading of Josephine Baker in Second Scene is kind of pre-ornamentalism, right? That it's,
yeah.
I'm interested in her precise in which she has been very abstract and used as abstract. And people don't see that because they're too busy paying attention to the fleshliness, right, in Baker. And when they do that, they don't see the art of her work. They don't see the ways in which her work actually talks back to the great white modernists who are trying to, encase her, right?
Yeah.
Whatever. And so I actually think that ornamentalism is also an important way to think about Black femininity, and that's why at the end of ornamentalism, there's a coda that is about Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, because Beloved is probably famous for its one of the most famous passages from Beloved is when one of the characters gave kind of tribute to body. But I do a little reading that sort of shows that, in fact, even within that tribute to the body, there was actually a lot that is about the ontology of objectness and of ornament. But quickly to go back to Freud and Lacan, I love the idea of thinking about the Asiatic yellow woman as the yellow woman as a thing that doesn't fit. One of the things that I noticed recently is that, or a question I often ask my students is that why is in science fiction, why is the teleology of Blackness the monster, as in Get Out, the monstrous, the monster in Get Out, but the theology for the Asiatic is the cyborg? What happens to the Black body is that it gets hacked up in some horrible lab. What happens to the yellow body is that it gets put together in some clean lab. There's something so interesting about that bifurcation. And so I was hoping today I could sort of rethink that bifurcation in some ways.
Yeah. And thank you so much. I have to say, the way you think, the way you treat this material, and I completely agree about the dangers of comparison. Your work is much more, it takes these cases and it goes so deep, rather than trying to slide back and forth between a comparison. You get so deep into the kind of structure of these epistemologies and ontologies. I mean, it really, the Yellow Woman, I understand what you meant when you said that you really thought of it, ornamentalism, you thought of it as a theory of being, and I completely understand that. I totally agree with that. And that work is what is so important to us and our students as we try to go forward into what for us is a field that is very, very good at talking technically and even philosophically about certain kinds of objects, but has not been historically that good at talking about racialized and issues of gender. feminized issues. And we learned so much from you and your work, and we appreciate it. And really,
Thank
really
you. It was
thank
a
you
delight to be here. Thank you, everyone, for wonderful questions.
Thank you.
I'm very grateful.
Okay. Thank you.
Good night.